Hello, this is Alex Barbas, founder of Arouca Press, and I'm here with Phillip Campbell, the author of one of our newest books, The Way of Life. And I'm actually here at his house in Michigan.
We're chilling in the dining room.
Yeah, he lives in the country. I'm a city boy, so he lives in the country. This is, it's quite nice, actually. But yeah, we're here to discuss his book, which I think is one of our great books of Catholic spirituality that I think would be of help to a lot of people. But
well, I'm really glad you're here. I do a lot of interviews, and I always love when I get to do like a personal sit down with somebody. So you were out in you're Canadian, and you were crossing over to.
Well, yeah. I live in Canada, but I'm actually from the States.
Oh, that's right. You're a born Michigander. Right?
I am. Well, although I grew up in New York City, but I was born in Detroit. But I've lived in Canada for almost 14 years now. So.
Canadian now, but we met. We met for Mass this morning at the St. Joseph Shrine in Detroit.
That's right.
Which is run by the Institute, and now we're out here in rural Michigan to chat about my book, and I'm so glad you're here.
Really, it is a great honor to talk to you. This, by the way, this is the first time I've ever done an interview like this. So,
so make sure everyone leave mean comments.
Yeah, exactly. Oops. All right. Well, so the first thing I want to do is just ask you a few general questions.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to get to specific questions about, the chapters in this really excellent book. So first, tell us a bit about why you started writing on, spiritual topics, if you will, on your blog.
Yeah, well, I founded Unam Sanctam Catholicam years ago. I actually founded it in 2004, but I didn't really start blogging out until 2007. And as many traditional Catholics at the time, I started as an outlet to gripe about things that, kind of like, why, like, Marty Hagen sucks. Like, why do I hear Marty Hagen at Mass? Where's the I used it to complain about problems in the church because there was no real voice for that, that I was aware of. But then eventually, as time went on, I guess spiritually, not that there's still things we couldn't complain about, but I got to the point where I wanted to dig into some of the more meat of the spiritual life, and because ultimately I've always believed that the faith is about transformation, in the image of Christ. I wanted to dig down to some of that stuff, so I started writing about my own experiences, and then kind of over time addressing other experiences that I would see friends or people in my life going through, and trying to kind of help bring people some balance, not from the perspective of like a spiritual master, but just to try to help them put things in perspective and find a balanced way to live the faith in their life.
Yeah, I think you use the word balance. I think that's one of the many things I took away from this book. And again, I'll get into it in more detail, that you really want the reader of this book to find balance amidst this crisis. There is a crisis, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's hard not to say that there's a crisis.
Right.
But I think you're right. A lot of people can lose focus. I know personally, if I'm not careful, I can easily lose my focus. So I think that's a very interesting point you made. So you've written a lot. Now, why did you choose these particular essays or articles for this book? What struck you about those particular pieces of writing?
Well, there was a lot to choose from. I've done over, on the Unam Sanctam blog, there's over 1,300 essays, and then on the sister website, there's something like 300 or 400 as well. So there's quite a bit to choose from. But I picked ones that were really born of my own, the depths of my own experience, like things that I suffered through or struggled through, or things that other people were struggling through, and I was trying to kind of hold their hand through it. Basically, things that would kind of reach out to the reader as having a kind of like a personal depth to it.
Right. Now, this is kind of one of the first questions I think I should ask is, why the title The Way of Life? What's the meaning behind that title?
Well, in the literal sense, the way of life, I took it from the opening of the ancient Christian text, the Didache, which opens up by saying there are two ways, one of life and one of death, but there's a great difference between the two ways. So it's literally taken from the Didache. But I'd been thinking about this a lot in the past few years, especially since the crisis in the church has amplified with the liturgical wars since Traditionis Custodes, and thinking about what it means to live the faith today in the church, in the secular world. And I was struck reading the New Testament how the New Testament doesn't use the word Christianity. It calls the faith the way multiple times. And I go through it in the introduction to the book. But for example, in Acts 9:2, it says that Saul went to Damascus, quote, so that if he found any belonging to the way, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And then also in the book of Acts, it says that the Jews in Corinth, quote, refused to believe and publicly maligned the way. And there's all these verses where the faith is called the way. And then even Jesus himself, we could go back to like, I am the way,
right,
the truth, and the life. And so I thought that's very interesting, because there is a tendency in Christianity to compartmentalize it, to think of, like, if you ask, what is Christianity? Like, well, is it a series of intellectual propositions? Is it a moral system? Is it a series of rituals? You know, like, is it a shared artistic and cultural heritage?
Right.
Is it a personal credo? Like, it's all of those things. But, like, I wanted to try to get a comprehensive take on it. Like, and this term really helped me. The way. A way is like something that you. It's a manner of being.
Yeah, so it's totally encompassing the human being, right? He has to see everything through, well, I guess the eyes of the faith. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like a holistic view of the faith, and I also like the way that the concept of the way, it implies that, like, when you're going somewhere, like, the way is like the road that you're taking, right? Like, it is the path by which you travel, but it's also the journey itself.
Sure.
You know, it's the direction you take, and it's the act of going. Like, you go on your way, you know.
Yes.
Or you say, I'm taking that way. So I like that, because that's one aspect of the Christian life that's very important. Like the Catechism says about the Eucharist, that's the source and the summit of the faith. It's the foundation from which we proceed and the place to which we're going. And I think the term way encompasses that it is the path upon which we're on, but it's also the journey, and it's the destination, because Jesus Christ is the way. So that was my thinking in choosing this.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And another thing I wanted to mention is your friend Dom Noah Morbique. Am I pronouncing his last name correctly?
As far as I know.
Okay. So he also has some essays in this book. What connection do you have with him, and why did you feel, it was something good to include some of his writing?
Yeah, Dom Noah Morbique. Many of your listeners, if anyone's been around online trad blogging for a while, they might know about Dom Noah. Dom Noah is a old friend of mine. He is the preceptor and novice master of the North American Preceptory of the Militia Templi, which is commonly known as the Order of the Poor Knights of Christ, or the Revived Templars, the real Templars, not the weird Masonic Templar or whatever. But Noah was instrumental in helping me found the original Unum Sanctam sister site back 11 years ago. We became internet friends, and he started blogging with me on the main blog. And he was profoundly interested in spiritual topics, and he wrote some of the a couple very enduring essays on the blog. He doesn't really have time for blogging with me anymore.
Yes.
So this is kind of a thank you to him for his years of contribution to the blog, and also for his work helping me set up the website. So I included a couple of his essays here as well. But we always used to talk on the phone and have these long spiritual conversations. And a lot of his spirituality has very much affected mine. And go ahead.
Well, I was going to say his essays, I thought they fit seamlessly into this book. It was like as if there was one author. They were really good. And I'll get to some of his material later. No, that's great. Okay, well, the first thing I kind of want to get into some of the chapters. I don't think we can get into all of it because there's a lot in it.
Yeah, there's 40 chapters.
Right, and in preparing for this, I highlighted the whole book practically.
His book is full of sticky notes, guys.
Yes.
Sticky notes.
It was great to kind of dig into this even more, apart from publishing it. But I'm just going to start with a couple of questions, and maybe you can just kind of expound upon it. So from chapter 1. So chapter 1 is called, Balancing Truth and Humility.
Yeah.
You talk about the connection between certitude and arrogance, which is I thought, pretty interesting. If I have certitude of the faith, could that lead to arrogance? What's the difference between the two?
Yeah, well, there's a sense in which if you possess the truth about something, if you're not careful, you can become arrogant about the fact that you possess it. Like you can start to feel special that you have access to this, or you can be dismissive about people who don't. You can have a sort of like the fact that you're so certain gives you a sort of haughtiness.
Sure.
And anyone who's ever talked to anyone online about religion at all. Like, this is true, right? People can get overbearing and haughty and so I started questioning, how can you grow in certitude of faith or in the certainty of your faith without taking that on, without becoming, like, how can you be humble about what you know, but also be absolutely confident that you know it?
Right, right.
So that's what led me to address this, because I think it's important, especially if we're talking to folks who don't agree with us, and I gave several suggestions in the book.
You did, yes.
Yeah, and one of the big ones was to resist viewing the faith in sectarian terms.
That's what I highlighted, and I was going to actually read some of it, but I'd rather I'd rather the author read it. Do
you want me to read it?
Sure, okay, absolutely.
So I said, it's easy to treat the faith, especially traditional Catholicism, as a sort of socio-political movement, viewing it through a lens that is almost sectarian. Traditional Catholicism has its own media outlets, its own talking heads, its own talking points, its own publications, partisans, and its own agenda. Not that it is wrong to have these things by any means, but it does mean we must always be on guard against treating the faith the way we would treat our own moribund secular politics. The faith certainly has socio-political ramifications, but it is not at its heart a socio-political movement, and refusing to treat it as such helps dissipate some of the hostility that comes with sectarianism.
Ooh, that's I think that's very challenging, I have to admit. I know that when I found the faith, I think early on, I probably saw the faith maybe in in rather sectarian terms, I would say. But I think you're right. The faith is not sectarian. It's the truth. It's the truth, and we need to bring people to the truth, but we can't view it in these terms. I think
it's not a political struggle. And so we don't need to have the energy of of a mass media like talking head.
Sure.
When the faith is a way, right?
Yeah.
And we think about where we came. I wasn't born into the faith, And even if I was, like, it's not like I was born with all the knowledge and
Sure.
Like, we all have to, like, we climb, we climb like a ladder. And if someone's not at the same point on the ladder that we're at, like by what right are we arrogant with them? You know, like, I used to be at a different spot on the ladder. That's just how God draws us through different ways. So I think just because we might feel or believe or know that we are at a different spot or higher up or have access to some truth that someone else doesn't know, there's no grounds for being haughty about it. And we have to remember too, and I put this in the book too, faith is a gift, right?
That's right.
It's not ours. We like to feel like it's something we discovered, that we sought for, that we built, but we have to remember it's a gift in multiple ways, that divine revelation didn't have to be made. God chose to give it to us. It was delivered to us by our forefathers, by the church, and that in a theological sense, the gift of faith is something that's infused in us that we don't earn. We can nurture the faith that we have, but we need to really remember that faith is a gift and to be thankful for what we have.
And you're right, and also that it's a treasure, and we don't want to lose it. It's easy to lose, and I think later on in the book you talk about the loss of faith and kind of the what happens when someone loses the faith, and it just points back to the fact that the faith is a gift, and we have to treasure it, we have to guard it, and not be, as you said, haughty about it and humble about it. You open the book with quite a.
If we really believe what St. Paul says, where he says, "Christ came into this world to save sinners, of whom I am chief." If we have that ethos about how we came to faith and our own salvation, like, we really have to have the disposition of, I'm just a beggar trying to show you where I can find some food. That's really the proper disposition, I think.
I agree. I'm gonna kind of go on to chapter 5. Not that the other chapters aren't good, but chapter 5 really struck out to me as quite an interesting chapter. So it's called The Greatest Schism.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you hear the word schism.
You hear it a lot these days.
But it's not what you think. This is a different type of rupture, if you will. And I'll just kind of read what I had here in preparation. You speak of the fracture between theology and ascesis. I don't know if I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And spirituality and mortification. Could you explain this division that you see, which you says kind of gets to the heart of really all of our problems, and even, I think you mentioned, the modernist crisis?
Yeah, so the in our heritage, the great spiritual writers and theologians were also ascetics, to varying degrees. Not all of them were St. Anthony, sleeping on a rock in a cave, but they all practiced asceticism. St. Benedict, who gave us the most enduring monastic rule in the West, he lived in a cave for 3 years and always lived a rigorous, even when he was in the monasteries, lived a rigorous life. The fastings and the vigils that St. Teresa of Avila underwent, John of the Cross, even St. Thomas Aquinas, he was extremely austere in his personal life. He went about barefoot. He lived in, his cell was probably pretty drab and clammy, something that we would probably not tolerate.
Sure.
You think of St. Francis of Assisi, but not just the great spiritual leaders, but like even the theologians. We forget that St. Augustine of Hippo, he's also known for formulating a rule. There's the Augustine canons that were later formulated based on a rule that came from, he had basically a monastery in his episcopal residence where he was living a monastic existence. So the point being that in the past, our great theologians and our spiritual leaders were living lives of mortification. And nowadays you get to a place where it's like, I can just become a theologian. I just take these master's classes.
Sure. Yeah.
I maybe go online. I do this diocesan training program, and I take these night classes, and I can become a spiritual director. But there's no. I mean, I'm not judging what people are doing in their private life, so I'm just making that clear. I don't know what people are doing in their houses,
Right.
But I'm saying that culture has disappeared from the church, where we're expecting our theologians and our spiritual leaders to be living lives of mortification. But in fact, it is that ascetical existence that helps detach one from worldly ways of thinking and living to give you those spiritual insights.
I highlighted this. That's profound what you said. You said in the past, we had theology and spirituality that proceeded from a life of faith, lived out in all its rigor. Today, it is largely, as you just said, it is largely the domain of experts whose approach is extremely anthropocentric because it is book-learned.
Yeah.
Based on the latest theories and the product of unaided human reason.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's like the and we see this all over our society with like the culture of experts and administration and bureaucracy, and it's kind of like the spilling out of that into theology and spiritual life.
Sure.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's what I called the greatest schism in the book, is the schism between our theology and our reason, and then living an ascetical existence in whatever way is, appropriate for our state in life.
Sure. Okay, that's thank you for your words there. I highlighted the next chapter, and it's probably it's related, as you even say in the beginning.
Yeah, they kind of go together.
Yeah. So we often hear about mortification, penance in terms of the Christian life. Why is mortification, why is penance even necessary? Shouldn't all we need to do is just love, right? Love Christ. Isn't that the only thing we need to do? Well, why do we need to, mortify ourselves?
Yeah, well, I mean, St. Paul says we're supposed to. He says, I chastise my body and bring it into subjection, lest perhaps when I have preached to others, I myself should become a castaway. And then he encourages everyone else to do the same thing. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you mortify the deeds of the flesh, you shall live. And then again in Colossians, mortify your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanliness, lust, evil, concupiscence, etc. So first off, mortification is simply obligatory for every Christian. It's simply commanded in the New Testament. But why is it commanded? Because mortification simply means to put to death. And in case you haven't, this is going to be a big news flash. The spiritual life is hard, right? Persevering is hard. We have concupiscence. We have a disposition towards selfishness, and it's in the struggle against that we develop virtue, right? And that entails putting to death our baser impulses. And like St. Paul says, taking even every thought captive and bringing it into alignment with the will of Christ. So mortification, putting things to death, is a way of, as I see it, reordering the internal balance, where, like, if you're not mortified, it's like you're just being passive to your desires, right? And to servicing your gratifications. And your reason is just kind of following along, justifying yourself. Then when you mortify, it's kind of like a way of saying, like, no, my reason is on top. Like, yes, my body might be saying this, but I'm in charge here. I control the ship.
Do you think it's true that even lawful desire, we should mortify even lawful desires, right? I mean, is that part of it?
Yeah, I think so.
We know about sin. We have to avoid sin, sinful pleasures, but even lawful desires seems to be something that, I mean, at least I've read and kind of understood.
Right.
That would even help us.
Yeah, it would. It's kind of like, to use a comparison to athletics, which St. Paul frequently uses, that comparison with the spiritual life as a kind of race or game, or envisioning some sort of Greek Olympic competition. it's a difference between saying I'm just going to avoid the junk food, you know, which we should be doing anyways,
right,
versus I'm going to take positive steps to exercise, to do these other things to make my life healthier, you know. And so even things that aren't bad, we should mortify for the sake of building up our spiritual vitality, you know. And those acts of detachment help us to order ourselves towards God more fully. And I think that's the fundamental message you get through all Christian literature about the act of mortification, detachment, because, and I won't rant about this too long, but I think we talk about this elsewhere. Holiness, like the etymology of the word holy means to be set apart, right? So you think of like holy water. This is water that's set apart for a use that's not secular, you know, or holy oil. Holy people are people who are set apart, right? And so obviously the more we can set apart our lives for God, that's what holiness is. And part of the way we do that is by divesting ourselves of attachments to even things that are lawful. Yes. Not because they're bad.
Right.
But just because it helps us to be set apart.
Yes. Now, this is, I mean, this is maybe a bit of a tangent, but do you think in the modern church, not per se what the church offers, but do you think in the modern church there's a mentality that, you know, people don't need to mortify themselves? What do I mean by that? There seems to be less of an emphasis on fasting, mortification.
Yeah, well, I do agree with you. And in one sense, it's because they're afraid of looking too negative or dour. Like they want the faith to be like happy. You know, and I agree Catholics should be happy. Yeah. We've talked about this many times. Yeah. But they're afraid of looking too miserable, like that just like, oh, to be Catholic, you need to flog yourself half to death and starve yourself. And you know, so they don't want to look like that. Number two, they're afraid because people are very imbalanced these days. So they're afraid that if you tell someone to, like I heard of a pastor who preached on fasting a couple times, and then like multiple parishioners were like, my family developed eating disorders because of your homily, you know, telling us to fast, you know, telling them to fast, and now my daughters have eating disorders, and they're like blaming the pastor because he mentioned fasting. So people are very unbalanced, and I think there's a fear of that. And also I think there's been, and this is something that Dom, Noah, and I have talked about many times, is there's kind of like a bastardization of Saint Teresa's Little Way that is very popular, where the Little Way, of course, is one of the most popular spiritual principles today. And I love Story of a Soul. It's one of my favorite spiritual books. But there's kind of like a perversion of what Teresa's Little Way is, because her little way is that in order to be holy, you don't need to do extraordinary things. You just need to do ordinary things with extraordinary love.
Yes.
And that's a beautiful principle.
Sure.
And that's really at the heart of a lot of this book.
Yeah.
But it's kind of been bastardized to where instead of saying you only need to do little things or ordinary things with extraordinary love, it's just do ordinary things and that's good enough. Where it's kind of like this idea of like, instead of like any concept of strife or overcoming, it's just like, hey, the little things that you do, like they already make you holy. Like you don't really need to wrestle, you know, like realize that you doing the dishes, that is holiness. Now, this is a nuance here, and people might complain if they don't understand it. Obviously, doing the dishes can be an occasion of holiness. And Saint Therese even uses that example in Story of a Soul about her doing dishes. But the thing is, she's doing the dishes with extraordinary love. That is, she's investing that simple act with an extreme amount of love, ordering it towards God, using the little inconveniences to offer them up for the salvation of her sisters, for atonement for her own sins, right? Now, that's what makes it so valuable. Saint Therese did not say, just do the dishes and that's what makes you holy, you know?
Right.
So there's this sense where people want to be just affirmed wherever they're at. They want to be like, hey, Mrs. Housewife, like what you're doing, like that's just good. That's good enough, you know? Or Mr. Whatever you're doing, you're fine, you know? And so I think there is a reluctance to preach mortification because mortification implies that we're not fine where we're at, that we need to make effort. Now, obviously, the point of Teresa's Little Way is we don't all have to go to a mountain. We don't have to, sleep with our head on a rock or, fast for 40 days. But we do have to take the things we're doing and make a conscious effort to orient them towards God and towards detachment and for purposes of mortification. And if you're not doing that, that's not the little way.
It reminds me of something, and this is a famous saying from Archbishop Sheen. He said, "You don't need to wear a hair shirt. Your neighbor is a hair shirt." So
yeah.
I think that's a similar kind of principle, but yeah, it's very, very interesting. So we all need to be mortified.
Yeah, but if your neighbor is a hair shirt, then then how do you turn that towards holiness?
Sure.
Like, do you just be like, oh, my neighbor's a hair shirt, I'm suffering, therefore I'm making spiritual progress because I'm annoyed. Like you have to consciously wrestle with that and be like, I'm orienting this towards God, and you have to make it into a prayer.
Right. I'm going to stay on this chapter just for one more kind of bit. There's something that you wrote where I kind of related it to my own life. I mean, I don't want to get too personal, but you said it's towards the very end. It said, simply growing up in a broken home or living in poverty or enduring a tragedy of some kind or some kind of abuse does not mean the suffering has been meritorious. It can be if it is handled rightly, but the mere fact of suffering is not meritorious. You go on, and even if these things have been suffered, the call to mortification is constant. We can never say, I have denied myself enough in the past. I need not do it anymore. I found that very, very poignant.
That goes back to this point we were just talking about, where when you do endure some kind of suffering, whether it's being imposed from without or whether you like the growth is in how you deal with it, right? In what you do with that suffering, because we all know some person in our life who has lots of suffering, or they've had a bad, but it doesn't help them because all they do is gripe about it. All they do, it makes them bitter. Right? All they do is like, oh, what a victim I am. And it doesn't help them because they haven't handled it rightly. So the mere fact that we have crosses, it's all in the response prompted by grace. And the more we respond rightly, the more grace we receive.
And God will always give us grace to overcome any difficulty. I know I found that in my own life, whatever difficulties I've had, grace.
His grace is sufficient.
That's it. Yeah. That's it. Thank you. I'm going to go on to the next chapter. I mean, at this rate, we're going to go through every chapter, but don't worry. The next chapter is God loves you.
Oh, yes.
Very, very true.
Yeah.
I when I read this chapter, I just thought it offered us a lot of hope amidst all the scandals in the world, and there are a lot of scandals.
Yeah.
And I'm just gonna kind of highlight the section towards the end on page 36, if you're following.
Yeah.
Yes, there will be scandal. Yes, there will be embarrassment due to human error, arrogance, and sin. But ultimately, it is irrelevant to your own faith. Did Jesus rise or didn't he? He rose in power. That is what this day commemorates. Speaking of Easter.
Yeah.
And if you hold close to him, you have power too. Power to remake the world according to God's law, starting with yourself. So it's a very personal thing. Then the church, then the world. And this is what I highlighted exactly. It doesn't matter what they do. You hear all the scandals amongst hierarchy, etc.
Yeah.
You keep doing what you know you need to do. If the church needs holiness, you be holy. If the world needs compassion, you be compassionate. If you do not see Christians devoted to prayer, you be devoted to prayer. The kingdom is within you, and it starts with you. Heaven begins in your heart today. I mean, hopefully a reader that reads this and is struggling will come away with a lot of hope in that.
And it's not meant to be a kind of pie in the sky denial that there's scandal or that we don't care about scandal, but from the point of view of, okay, so I've read about this scandal, what do I do, right? How do I react? Well, in a certain sense, the scandal doesn't change how you react. You keep doing what, it's kind of like, I know what my master told me to do, and you keep doing what the master told you to do, and you focus on that. That's and a lot of times we think, and I do get flack for this online when I express this view because people don't like it, but, I've often said that these things aren't our concern ultimately. For example, we can get all worked up and think like, if the church was in a better state, then I would be able to live my calling better. Or if the country was this way, then I would do that. And I feel like that view is profoundly backwards. Like the church becomes better by us becoming better first, and that's the way it's always been. So I've always argued that like I don't start with the premise of I need to like crusade for the church to be fixed. I mean, I do. I want that, Right. But like from a point of view, again, of what do I do in my spiritual life, you focus on what Jesus said you need to be doing. Like, that you need to pray, you need to be compassionate, you need to be loving, you need the fruits of the Spirit, you need to be holy, you need sanctity. Those are the things that are your focus, or that they should be, right? And then there's a way that just holiness radiates out from that, And one of the great things I've loved about reading church history is the way that you always get this man or woman who is like, I just want to go live alone somewhere and just love God. Yeah. And then they end up like the head of an order of like 10,000 people, and they like reform half the continent.
That's right.
Like think of St. Francis Assisi walking out of his town naked, or clothed with, whatever rags, and he just wants to go do his thing, and he ends up like reforming the church's spiritual life. Or St. Benedict or St. Anthony, these are people who understood their priorities, or St. Teresa of Avila. They focus on their own spiritual life and becoming, they know that the most important thing is that Christ is made manifest in their life.
I also like to think that, okay, God put us in this situation here and now for a reason. Mm-hmm. We weren't born in the Middle Ages. We're born here, 2020, the 21st century, 20th century. We were born in that era. Now we have to make the best of the situation we're in now, but we're given the graces. We still have the sacraments. We still have the saints, the example of the saints. We have so much, in a certain sense, it doesn't matter what's happening in the church as far as scandal. In a certain sense,
yes, in a certain sense,
yeah, exactly. I'm not one to advocate for not caring or just
head
saying
in the sand, yeah,
exactly, or everything's okay. That's not what I'm saying, but. I think you said it, priorities. What are our priorities?
Yes, precisely. What are our, I've spent a lot of time talking about problems in the church on my website and articles, so it's not a thing to just ignore.
Sure.
But it's a question of priority. Like, we should put it this way. Do the scandals in the church determine the development of my spiritual life?
Right.
Or do they not? They should not. Whatever's going on in the church should not be determining the development of your spiritual life.
That's right.
Jesus Christ does, the gospel does, that's where we start. And then those other things, we pay attention to them, we work as best we can, but, we don't let ourselves become, determined by them.
That's absolutely true. All right, I'm going to go to the... Again, I can go through every chapter, but this chapter, it struck me as pretty profound because I'm a convert. So, chapter 10, Hearts of Stone to Hearts of Flesh.
Oh, that's the one with convert stories.
Yeah, I love them. them, and I'll tell you why. But they're about people, the different ways people came to the faith. And they're not, I would say, the reasons. Or the examples you gave are not people who came to the faith necessarily, primarily at least, through intellectual kind of, arguments, study, although that's important, I think in every case there would be, study and such. But that wasn't what brought them to the faith, and I found that really interesting.
They were converted by very beauty or music or
that's right. And I wrote down that God still draws people to Himself. I'll just relate something personally. Not a lot of people know about my own story, but whatever. But I came to the faith, I would say primarily through beauty and order. I would say, beauty insofar as I saw the church's liturgy, the traditional liturgy,
right,
and also Gregorian chant. That struck me as so beautiful and profound that. That led me to look into the claims of the church and such. But it was beauty that got me. It wasn't the Summa. I'm not saying the Summa is not important. But for me, and granted I was relatively young, so I wouldn't have understood the Summa anyway. But it was beauty that brought me to the faith. And it's true. I think, God draws people to the church through different means. And I would say, beauty is definitely one of the main things, main ways that He brings people to Him.
There's a story in the chapter about a couple that were getting married, and they were both kind of like non-practicing Catholics, and they were just looking for a venue for their wedding, and they just wanted a pretty church. Like, they didn't really consider themselves believers, and they were just driving through the country, and they come to this beautiful, historic, like neo-Gothic, 1870s church out in the country, and they kind of just walk in, kind of blissfully naive, and they're like, we want to get married here because it's a pretty church. And the pastor, who was someone I knew, he told me this story. He said that he greeted them, and he just kind of started giving them a catechesis on what the church is, why the art is so beautiful, what the art represented. And the couple were blown away, and by the end of that meeting, they signed up for RCIA.
Wow.
and they returned to the practice and they were married in that church.
Wow.
But in a totally different mindset. So They just walked in admiring the beauty, and the pastor just gave them a catechesis on what that symbolism represented, and then that was enough to get them back.
Wow. That's
Isn't that cool?
That's amazing.
Yeah, that couple was in when I taught RCIA, they were in my class.
Oh, they were?
Yeah, I didn't put that in the book.
Oh, you didn't?
This is how I heard the story. My pastor, he was like, hey, you're going to get this couple in your class, and this is their story, and I was blown away by it.
I'm just gonna. I'll just read a little bit from that section. Actually,
this is a different group.
It's page 54. At the very end, you will note that in none of the above cases was the person converted by hearing a bunch of arguments. It was other things: beauty, liturgy, a sense of their own sinfulness, the glory of Catholic culture. To be sure, after their hearts were converted, argumentation and intellectual reasoning stepped in to solidify them in their faith, but in none of these cases did rational argumentation precipitate their conversion. This is certainly not to say that nobody has ever argued into the faith. Many people are. But how God chooses to bring individuals into the church are as varied as people themselves. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was a great chapter. I'm going to skip to, again, there's so much I could say or we can talk about, but I'm going to skip to Dom Noah's article, and it's called "The Rosary and Poverty," which was quite a fascinating article.
Yeah.
The Rosary, everybody knows about the Rosary, but actually Leo XIII, he said that the Rosary is a remedy for the evils afflicting society, which I found was fascinating.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to read just a little section. He says, today, this is from Dom Noah.
Yeah.
Today the politics of envy and greed abound. This development is not surprising. In fact, it was predicted by our Holy Father, Pope Leo XIII of holy memory. If I'm not mistaken, didn't he write something like over 10 encyclicals on the Rosary, or at least he mentions the Rosary in quite a few encyclicals?
Yeah.
And he says, let's see, Pope Leo XIII on the next page had a remedy for these evils. And this is pretty hard-hitting. The remedy will not be satisfactory to those intellectuals who are not satisfied with anything unless it is comprehensive, nor will it be for those activists who mask their desire for vengeance with demands of justice in their moral vanity. Wow.
That's powerful.
That is powerful. The remedy is meditation on the joyful mysteries of the Holy Rosary. That's... and actually, there's another section I wanted to read from him, and this really struck me from Dom Noah. He said, if we tell the man with $1 that his suffering is in vain and that he need not be patient in it, then surely he will not be. If we tell the rich man that poverty is to be avoided, he will probably make sure he has more than enough for himself and not be generous in almsgiving. Both lead to more consequences here and in eternity. So I think he's saying by meditating on the Rosary, especially the joyful mysteries, we can have maybe a greater appreciation for maybe the spirit of poverty and how that can actually help society. Yeah,
he's arguing that that for those who are wealthy, they need to meditate on their spiritual poverty, right?
Yeah.
On detachment and for those who have temporal poverty, they need to meditate on the spiritual riches that are made available through the faith. But he's saying that in our modern world, we often see the opposite, where instead of trying to, instead of preaching on how riches can entangle us, which the scripture says that the love of money is the root of all evil.
Yes.
Right? Instead of preaching that, we, even though the Catholicism doesn't embrace a full prosperity gospel, it's some of it has bled into that, where we are kind of afraid to preach on the spiritual entanglements and dangers that come with wealth, because we might irritate the wealthy parishioners that we need to donate to fix the parking lot or whatever, and then with the poor. We almost have focused so much on the social justice aspect that it's an injustice that you're in this situation. We've almost forgotten to teach them how to seek God's consolation in their poverty.
That's right. So,
and that's why Leo XIII, writing in the midst of the labor crisis.
That's right, Rerum Novarum, right?
Yeah. He's saying that this spirituality that you see in the Rosary is a natural way to spiritually bring harmony between these problems between the rich and the poor.
Right.
He's not saying that's comprehensive by any means, because we know he has a whole encyclical on this, but he's saying from a spiritual perspective, we need to start with this sort of contemplation.
Wow. Hopefully that'll help people who are actually praying the Rosary to maybe meditate on some important truths.
Yes.
All right. The next chapter I wanted to talk about is really an interesting one. I think you had a response to this.
Yeah.
It's Alkwin to Higbald, A Christian View on Temporal Misfortunes.
Oh yeah.
First of all, why should we read someone from the Middle Ages talking about temporal misfortunes? How could that help us in the 21st century?
Well, I was so Higbald was the abbot of a monastery. I want to say the monastery of Lindisfarne, maybe in northern England, and Alcuin, of course, the famous monk from the court of Charlemagne. And Alcuin had heard that Higbald's monastery had been sacked by the Vikings, and all their stuff had been taken, and many of the brothers had been killed. And so Alcuin wrote Higbald a letter to comfort his friend in the misfortune. And the nature of the letter is very much not what we would expect. He says, "Do not be dismayed by this disaster. God chastises every son whom he accepts, so perhaps he has chastised you more because he loves you more." And then he talks about how Higbald should use this opportunity to become holier, to reflect on whether he's committed any sins he needs to repent of. And he basically tells him that, hey, this is part of God's providence, and you need to use it for your holiness. Which I was astounded by, because I wrote this because I was reading some commentary by some Catholics online who were having an argument about reaction to some disaster or some misfortune, and it was very much along the lines of, God would never do, kind of like you see like a flood or a natural disaster or something, and people say, did God do that? And they're like, oh, no, God didn't do that. God would, and it's kind of like, is God in control or isn't he? Like, he literally does natural disasters all through the scriptures and through Christian history. And I decided to look back and see like how a Christian 1,000 years ago, when they had some misfortune, how they processed it. And that's why Alkwins' letter struck out to me so much, because he was just kind of like, yeah, God did this. And if it's suffering, God chastens those whom he loves. There's a reason why this happened. God is good, we know that, and there must be some way that you can turn this to your advantage. And so I encourage you to meditate on that. He didn't pull any punches with him,
No.
And I think today, like if we were to take that, if I were to go to the people who just had their homes burned in Maui and be like, God did this, he wants you to learn something from it, or what, it would be just like, how horrible are you for saying that,
Right.
And I'm not saying that that Alcuin couldn't have been more empathetic in the way he worded these things.
Sure.
But then again, these are monks, they're professed monks whose purpose is to do this, so I'm not saying we need to exactly imitate this. But I am saying that that Alcuin has a very standard classical explanation for evil, that temporal misfortunes fall equally on everyone alike, and the difference is not in what happens to us, but in how we respond to it. And that's what he's encouraging Higbald to do. It's like, you can't change that this happened. The best you can do is have a holy response to it, and that's what God wants ultimately.
I think that's a healthier attitude than just saying evil exists, therefore there can't be a good God. That kind of argumentation you often hear, and that doesn't seem. Obviously, it's a philosophical. There's a philosophical thing, a theological, but that seems too simplistic.
It is too simplistic, but even beyond that, you hear people will try to kind of like section off parts of our temporal existence from God's causation. Like they will attribute, like if any good thing happens, oh, praise the Lord, bless the Lord, this happened. But then the tornado wipes out your town, and people are like, did God do that? Or why did God do that? And you'll even on Catholic radio, oh, God's not responsible for this, or God, whatever. Where it's kind of like they want to cordon off disastrous things and say God wasn't involved in that. That was just a fluke, or that was just, and it's kind of like, does God operate through the secondary causes of nature, or doesn't he? Now, I don't want to say like, yes, God, oh yeah, the reason the tornado destroyed your home is because God is punishing you for your wickedness. I would never say that, because Jesus says specifically that the disciples literally are talking about that, and Jesus says, he used an example. He says, you heard that story about those men that the Tower of Siloam fell and crushed them. In the gospel, he says this. He says, do you think they were worse sinners than anyone else? Because there was a tendency to think like, oh, if something bad happened, they must be getting punished for a specific sin, which is also in the heart of the book of Job as well. And Jesus says, no, that's not what's going on here. But he says, unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. That's like his takeaway. Don't try to reflect on and figure out, like, did this happen because those guys, like, did the tower fall on them because they were sinners? He says, no, you focus on yourself. Unless you repent of your sins, you're not going to be any better off than them. And that's what Alcuin tells Higbald. Maybe you didn't get killed by the Vikings. You're still alive, and so you can still work on your spiritual life, and so do it. And that's his takeaway. And if that seems harsh to us, it's because it encapsulates a whole worldview that we've kind of left behind, which is seeing God's providence through all the secondary things, the secondary causes in our lives, not just the ones that we like, but even the ones we don't like.
Wow. Thank you.
That's kind of deep.
Yeah, I'm trying to process this still.
Okay.
The next chapter is, I think you received a response from a reader. It's called Waves of Darkness.
Yeah.
And this, what I wrote is, you give a great response to a reader who's having a difficult time with what is happening today in the church. And I said, I think a lot of people can relate to what he said, but I think your response can help.
Yeah, so what this guy said was he read the article on Higbald and Alkwin, and he said that works for, like, natural disasters,
sure,
but not when, like, human beings are... He's looking at the world, and he's saying, we've got a corrupt financial system, scandal-ridden church, like republics on the verge of collapse, Western civilization is falling, there's, whatever. Everybody is evil. And he said, so how can I deal with this? He mentioned politics, media, war, education, music, entertainment, healthcare, law. Like, he brought up everything.
Yeah.
It's like everything is screwed, And so what I said, here's what, I'll just read it. I said, when I read this comment, my response is, friend, who told you to worry about such things? When were these problems entrusted to your care? What did our Lord say? He said, do not worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. So, and then I said, I'm convinced this passage from the Beatitudes is instrumental in staving off despair. Now, the commenter is right. Power, influence, money, media, institutions are all under the power of darkness right now. But is that really new? The devil said to Jesus, all this power I will give unto thee, and the glory of them, for it is delivered unto me, and whomsoever I will give it. The devil is saying 2,000 years ago that he had control over it then too. I don't know if that's accurate, if the devil was lying or telling the truth, but it's interesting. But the fact is, none of that's my business. My response to this evil must be the same as Christ's. Worship the Lord thy God, and him alone shall you serve. None of these other issues are my problem. And honestly, I'm not empowered to fix them. Like, I can't, like, what am I going to do? Like, reform Hollywood? Like,
so you know what people do? I find it that they want to put the whole weight of the world on their shoulders.
They do.
And that is a burden that is not theirs. It's nobody's burden. No one can continue to live the Christian life with that type of burden on their shoulders. They're going to break.
They are.
And you see it so often. People, losing the faith. Again, there's a chapter you talk about that.
It's because it's easier to take. It's a big burden, but in another way, it's easier to take on that burden than it is to be nice to your mother-in-law, or something like that.
Sure. That's right. That's right.
It makes you feel like you are crusading, that you are a martyr because you're suffering this. But like, our Lord never told us to take all that on. What our Lord said specifically, here's some quotes. 1 Thessalonians 4:11, aspire to live quietly and mind your own affairs. That's right from the New Testament. Pray that we may lead quiet and peaceable lives, 1 Timothy 2:2, right? Sufficient for the day is its own trouble, right? Christ really only asks us to be faithful with what we have been entrusted with, the little bit that's been given to you. So what's been given to you? You've got a family, you've got a job, you've got a little business, Catholic publishing business that you run. There it is. That's your world. That's what goes on your shoulders.
That's right.
Right? Not like what the Vatican is doing, what the Canadian government is doing. Obviously, you can care about these things and have opinions, but like, we're speaking of the burden that you take on mentally, spiritually, right? Those aren't your burdens.
That's right. That's right.
Commit it to the Lord. Pray about it. Give it to God.
That's right. When you said, I'm just going to read. It's also in the same chapter. You said, "I have a deeper peace and more profound sense of God's mercy than I have in years past." That's just my experience. I understand that for someone who is in crisis, that will certainly not be their experience. but don't tell me my religion is broken because you are in crisis. My faith is not in crisis, and nothing is broken for me.
Yes.
Wow. I mean...
Yeah, so there's people that will say, like, Catholicism is broken because, and then they list their problems. And it's kind of like, we were talking about this at breakfast, like, people have a tendency to universalize their own experience.
Yes.
Like, it's broken for me, and therefore it is broken, you know?
That's right.
And it's kind of like, you know what? Don't speak for me, you know? Just because you're having problems doesn't mean I am having problems.
That's right.
And it's okay for me to not have problems. It doesn't mean that I'm ignoring the issues, you know. But don't come out here and be like, all these things are happening. I suffered through this crisis, and therefore there's this huge existential problem with the faith that I need to bring to everybody's attention and expect everybody to agree. Because just because you stumbled, you know, doesn't mean I have to stumble or that I'm wrong for not stumbling.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah. We have to keep going. Keep going. This is kind of a related chapter. I'm jumping ahead to chapter 23.
Okay.
Escaping our subjectivity.
Yeah.
And in it, you describe the patterns of a loss of faith. I found this absolutely fascinating. Why? Because I've known people who have, you know, lost the faith, and you kind of wonder why. How does someone lose the faith?
Yeah. Did you want me to review that process?
Yes. I just highlighted one section. It said the church, for the person who loses the faith, the church as an object of affection is no longer desirable.
Oh yeah, so this chapter is about how, like, you will often see people who are in the process of losing their faith.
Yes.
Online, and maybe they're like talking about their struggles, and then you have people whose faith is intact, and they talk past each other.
Oh, right.
Because they don't recognize what the other is dealing with.
Right.
So like a person who is losing their faith, they might be talking about why they're losing their faith, and the person whose faith is intact will be giving intellectual arguments for why they shouldn't abandon the faith. But the thing is, when people are losing faith, the reason they lose it is because the church is no longer an object of affection. They don't feel like it's something that draws their love. So the way we gain faith, you know, we start typically with belief. You know, this is the process by which we grow faith. We grow in faith as we believe. And then because we believe, we nurture our faith, it yields hope. Hope is like a chain that anchors us to our eternal destiny. It like forms a tangible connection between now and eternity and strengthens us on the way. And then once we have that hope, once we're plugged in, it brings forth charity and love, and it helps us to see the church, to see God as objects of affection, right? And it starts faith, hope, and love, right? But then when people lose faith, they lose it in reverse order. Like they lose love first. So the first thing that happens is the church or whatever ceases being worthy of affection in their mind. And so they don't love the church. Maybe they've griped at it too long. Maybe the church has done too many things, pushed them over the edge, and they can no longer affirm that the church is worthy of love. They only see its defects. Once they see that, then it's not surprising that their hope withers, like the umbilical cord that connects you to the supernatural reality withers. And then if you no longer have love and you're no longer connected, the faith, the intellectual affirmation falls last, right? So what happens when people are losing faith is they're no longer seeing the church as something lovable. Right?
That's right.
But then people come to them and give them arguments intellectually on why they should believe, right? But the problem is one of in the affections, that their love is growing cold first.
How would you approach someone like that? I mean, what do you do? I mean, in such a case.
Oh,
Not
and then the other person too. I should say, because the other person's love has grown cold, they also fail to see the weight of the arguments.
I see.
Because the arguments might be very weighty, you know, But if they don't love the object that the arguments are tending towards, it's kind of like many listeners might have this experience where you had a teacher that you hated because they were mean or they were bad, and you also couldn't learn the subject because the teacher was so bad or because the teacher was mean or whatever. And then you get another teacher who is understanding, and then you learn the subject. Because the fact is, if you hate the teacher, it doesn't matter what they tell you, because you're not going to be receptive to it.
So if someone hates the institution, like already they hate the institution, you can't, there's an obstacle there. You can give them all sorts of intellectual arguments, but until that obstacle is kind of removed, then they won't even hear the arguments.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're saying?
Exactly. So what I was saying in the chapter is that when we are talking with people who are losing faith, we have to understand that, and I'm talking about people who have not totally lost faith, but they're in the process.
I see, yes.
They're hanging on by a thread, We have to understand that often it's an affective thing where it's about they're no longer seeing the church as something desirable. And we have to not approach it incorrectly by trying to make intellectual arguments. But I also call for people in the chapter, if they are one of these people who are wavering with faith, to have the humility to understand that just because you're in a place of suffering and you can't see the strength of the arguments doesn't mean that the arguments are false. It means maybe you're numb to them because you've heard them so many times. Maybe because you're in a state of crisis, you're not appreciating the logical force of them. So again, it was kind of a call for people to stop talking past each other and to kind of understand where the other person is coming from, and to address those issues instead of just kind of firing the same old cannonades against each other.
And oftentimes, it's people who are actually, they're very bright, who lose the faith or are in the process of losing the faith. So it's not as if they can't appreciate arguments, but for some reason they're not seeing the church as lovable anymore. It's very interesting to me.
And you'll find people, I think we've all seen folks like this online. We might even be able to think of some ourselves, but we're not going to name names. But you get these people who were Catholic once and they were brilliant, and had extreme insight and nuance, and then they lose the faith, and you see them down the road and they're making like high school level atheist, they're kind of like, really, like they're making like high school level atheist criticisms that are just like ridiculous, and it's like how did you fall to that level? Like you would have, 10 years ago you would have like seen how ridiculous that is, but it's because they no longer see the church as something lovable, and ergo the church's arguments don't penetrate.
Carol Robinson, whom I love very much, we're publishing all of her works. She relates in one of her essays, which is going to be published soon, in a book, about a certain priest from the UK. I won't name the priest. He's no longer a priest and no longer a Catholic, but he was brilliant. He's still alive.
Right.
And he's now considered like a great philosopher.
Okay.
But he was a priest, and at some point, and I'm wondering if this applies to him. He knew scholastic philosophy. He knew the faith inside and out, probably. But at some point, he stopped believing, and he eventually became an agnostic.
Yeah.
So how does that happen? I mean, this is a priest, brilliant philosopher, but at some point, it would have to be he no longer saw the church as lovable.
Something
happened, right? I mean,
yeah.
So
or sometimes people grapple with something they can't get. People, this would be a good segue into talking about this, but people often grapple with if they can't resolve something. They have a problem they can't resolve, and they aren't comfortable with the idea of holding propositions that they can't resolve. So they might be like, well, let's say I'm struggling with same-sex attraction or whatever, but the church and moral law teaches this, and so they have a hard time resolving those two. So rather than saying something like, yes, I have this and I experience it, but I also know it's objectively disordered, they have to have one side triumph entirely.
That's,
where it's like, okay, either I'm going to full-blown reject the church's teaching and embrace this, or I have to kind of try to completely repress it and deny that I even have it, and then you can get. And I know many, I know people who get married, and then later it's like the man was gay, and he was just like kind of like in denial that he was homosexual, and he thought that like getting married to a woman would paper it over, cure it, or whatever, and then it caused all sorts of problems. So, but the fact is, like, you often have people that can't deal with a tension that they can't resolve, and they have to push it over one side or the other.
Wow. It's I found those chapters. Well, actually, the next chapter is going to be somewhat related as well. But yeah, it's fascinating. I think in modern life also kind of precipitates a lot of these tensions and these struggles. But I think people have always struggled.
Right.
But I think it's more so now. We're very much. We're not in a Christian society anymore.
No,
so.
Of course not. There's all sorts of struggles we never thought we'd have to deal with.
But again, God gives us grace.
Mm-hmm.
That's the next chapter I wanted to mention is chapter 29, the dark mirror of faith.
Yeah,
that was quite fascinating. The first thing I wanted to just point out is, because you talk about the certitude of faith. What do you mean by the certitude of faith? How does the faith give us certitude?
Wait, are you talking about this chapter?
Yes, chapter 29. You say, let's see.
Okay. So in this chapter, I'm not talking about the certitude of faith in the sense of the propositions of faith.
Sure. Okay.
I'm talking about when you're trying to resolve something in your own life, right? So I come across a lot of Catholics who are wrestling with things, and they're trying to understand how to reconcile them, right? They want things to be. They want to settle an issue, and they feel like their spiritual life is on hold until they can settle it, like until they can get some certain conclusion, right? And what I talk about in this chapter is that faith, so I'll just say it right here. It says, you do not need to resolve your difficulties in order to maintain faith. That's on page 148. You don't need to resolve your difficulties. So oftentimes we get these problems in our life. Maybe they're doubts, maybe they're things that we're questioning. Maybe they're personal struggles. And we often feel like we want to resolve them. And we feel like our spiritual lives are on hold, or our faith is being damaged until we can find some answer to these problems. And what I'm arguing here is that faith, by its very nature, is imperfect. It is provisional. That is, faith passes away once we get to heaven, right? It's imperfect. St. Paul compares it to looking in a dark mirror where you see the outlines of things, but you don't see perfectly. Remember, the symbol of faith from the Old Testament is Jacob wrestling with the angel. So there is what I call in the chapter a not yetness about faith, where there's like a sense in which there's going to be a sense of imperfection. Not in like the propositions of faith, but in our experience of faith, right? Even St. Paul said for him it was like seeing in a mirror dimly. And what I wrote in the book is there's going to be a sense of imperfection, a deep yearning, a wrestling, a sense of not yetness, a wandering about in the murky dusk of existence, struggling to come into the brilliance of daylight. Like, we're all looking for that. We're all looking for that, that Mount Tabor moment when Jesus is illumined and we see the whole reason for everything. But the fact is, like, that's never made a condition for us having faith or persevering. We're supposed to wrestle with things. Like, that's part of faith, is you're supposed to not understand things. You're supposed to struggle. You're supposed to try to figure out how things balance. And most importantly, you're supposed to be able to go on even if you don't get the answers. Like, I knew a woman whose son had had like a cognitive brain degeneration, where he was slowly losing mental function, over the years. And she was really struggling to come up with a reason for why it was happening. Like she would say, well, maybe God wanted me to learn this or that, or maybe it's happening, or maybe, this happened and I met Dr. So-and-so and that was going to bring me into contact with this person. And she kind of had to have the flow chart mapped out in her head of why this had happened, and that's very understandable. And I empathize with her desire to do that. But what I'm saying is, like, we don't have to have that picture. In fact, usually we don't. We are meant to simply wrestle with things. We are meant to grapple with things and just go forward. So in other words, we don't need to have a matter settled.
Right.
And we could talk about this with relation to the crisis in the church and the papacy and what's going on in Rome. Like, I don't have to figure out exactly what I believe about under what circumstances could the Pope lose his office.
Sure.
Like, I don't have to have an answer.
And you see that people are talking about that and wrestling with it, which is
it's good.
It could,
you can wrestle with it, but you don't.
But they're getting obsessed about it. As if they need to settle the question.
Right, as if their faith can't go on until they settle the question.
That's right.
Yeah, and I'm arguing here you don't need to settle the question. Like,
well, I'll just read what you said.
Go ahead.
It goes perfectly with what you're saying right now. Perhaps it is part of our Western rationalist bias that makes us feel like our faith will be stronger once we have sorted everything out intellectually, once we can, quote, reason it all out, end quote, like some sort of engineering schematic.
Yeah. Once we can see the blueprint, then we'll be fine and we'll get it. So what I'm challenging people to do is to go back to what St. Paul said, that when you look in the mirror, when you look in faith, it's like looking in a mirror dimly. And we have to actually not only not be uncomfortable with that, but actually embrace it, And I'm not calling for a kind of like quietism, but I'm calling for us to embrace the not yetness of faith, and to the fact that there's certain things that you will never be able to resolve. You will not see the answers to them. And that doesn't mean that you can't go on. That doesn't mean that your faith is in crisis. Maybe you've convinced yourself it is because you feel like you can't move unless you can see the schematic. But I was thinking, and I'll just say one more thing. When my kids were little, or when any kids are little, the beautiful thing about little kids is you can just be like, all right, get in the car, and they're like, okay, and they just go.
Yeah.
They're not like, where are we going? Why are we going there? How long are we going to be gone? Like,
Right.
They're just like, I just see people carrying around little babies, and they're just happy to be going anywhere, and they don't ask where they're going. They're just like, and Christ calls us to be childlike in how we trust His will, right? So, can we be a little bit like that? When God is like, I'm taking you somewhere. Let's be like, okay, I'm going for a car ride.
Yeah.
Instead of being like, where are we going? How long will we be there? Will I have time to do this when I get home? Like,
Yeah, I'd like to see the faith or being a Catholic. It's like a sort of an adventure, right? It's it is an adventure, but that's I think.
And again, I know there's people who are going to hear this and be like, oh, so you're saying we should ignore these things or just No, I'm not. But again, it's a matter of priority.
Right. The next chapter we're going to discuss. Again, it's related. I think if you think about it, every chapter is in a sense related to one another. Chapter 32 is True and False Dark Nights. So here's the thing. We often hear about the dark night of the soul.
Right.
That seems like some lofty, that's some lofty kind of mystical thing that we shouldn't even concern ourselves with. That's just for the saints.
Right.
But first of all, I'm just going to start off. What is a dark night of the soul, and how is that different from just say a period of desolation in a soul?
Yeah. So in a dark night, it's like there is So when a soul gets advanced in the spiritual life, there's a kind of progression from the head to the heart, where eventually there's a transition and there's Eastern and Western traditions on this, but there's a transition where the spiritual movements become more passive and contemplative. And you're moving from a field in which like human activity dominates into one where the soul is more responsive to God. And this comes through a kind of deprivation of consolations, where at an earlier stage, God provides the soul with all sorts of spiritual goodies to, like you pray and then you feel better you feel peace
to keep them going.
Yes. You offered something to God and you feel some relief afterwards. Mm-hmm. And this is like a final purification where God removes even those spiritual consolations to where there's literally no experience of benefit, even in the interior life, to what you're doing. You don't even necessarily feel better about what you're doing spiritually. And it's to completely break you away from any dependence on those things and to prepare you for the final stage in spiritual life, moving towards the unitive stage. Now, I, of course, do not claim to be anywhere close to that. I'm taking this from spiritual writers, yes. Right? What this chapter though is how we talked earlier about St. Teresa's little way being bastardized. Mm-hmm. That also happens with dark nights, where people will just be like, they'll go on social media, be like, oh, I'm going through a real dark night right now. And then they'll talk about some suffering. And they really think they're going through the dark night of the soul because they're having a hard time, or they're going through a normal period of spiritual desolation. And so what I was calling for here is for people to stop using this term whenever they're just having a dry spell. So you will get people online that they're simply having a dry spell in their spiritual life, or they're having a hard time and they say they're going through the dark night of the soul. And I'm just like, stop. Like, you're not,
It would seem the dark night of the soul, someone experiences that when they're actually progressing in the spiritual life, right? Yeah. When they're actually, again, wrestling, they're really advancing in the spiritual life, right? It's not someone not anyone just goes through a dark night of the soul.
Yeah, and if somebody's like, well, that's judgmental, how do you know they're not going through a dark night of the soul? I'm just going to say, no one who is actually going through the dark night of the soul goes on social media to complain that they're going through the dark night of the soul.
That's right. That's right.
So the very fact that you do that tells me you're not.
Yeah, that's...
oh my gosh, this unitive way is such a hassle.
You know what they say? I've read, again, this is just book learning, but I've read that this is related to that bishops have to be in the unitive way. It's interesting. Like
to what? To be a good bishop? Or?
Well, they should be, when they become a bishop, they should have been advanced in the spiritual life, right?
Yeah.
I guess that's ideally, right?
That'd be phenomenal.
Yeah, that would be great if it... Yeah.
Anyway. As it is, though, most of them need to start the purgative way.
That's it, right? That's right. So anyway, that's fascinating. Chapter 35, again, it's related to chapter 32. It's called Doubt and the Christian Faith. Interesting topic, because I'll just ask this question. The topic of doubt. Can we doubt an article of the faith? What do we mean by doubt, and can we doubt an article of the faith, or some aspect of the faith? Maybe kind of explain that.
Right. So, all of modern philosophy is predicated upon doubt. Going back to Descartes and etc. There's a kind of epistemological skepticism about our ability to know things. And so it's become very entrenched, and it's even seeped into Christian thought, where people sometimes almost treat doubt as a virtue, where and people are almost going back to the dark night. Like, some people are treating the dark night as if it's a kind of doubt, And you saw this a couple times with like Saint Mother Teresa, where when her journals were published, where she was explaining the dark night, which I believe she went through. and people were treating it as if she was doubting the faith.
Right.
And they're like, even Mother Teresa doubted her faith. And no, Mother Teresa was explaining the dark night of being deprived. And she was saying things like, I feel desolate, I don't feel you. That's what the dark night is. That's not doubting Mother Teresa wasn't like, oh, I'm really not sure if Jesus is real. So what is the relation of doubt to faith? Can we doubt? So doubt is a state of mind where it's like you're suspended between contrary propositions and you can't assent to either one. Now, sometimes you can have like negative doubt where there's just an absence of evidence for either proposition, like somebody's arguing point A and point B and you're not seeing a strong case for either one. Or you can have positive doubt, which is where they both are very strong cases and you still can't decide. So doubt is not a denial. A person who is denying something, they are saying like, I deny that this is the case. A person who's doubting is just unable to make a resolution. So now Christianity being a revealed religion, our faith is not based on our ability to empirically judge things, right? So it says that we don't believe, it says in many places, in the Modern Catechism, in Vatican I, etc., that we don't believe because we have examined every proposition of faith and come to a logical demonstration that convinces the intellect. We believe on the strength of it's revealed by God, who cannot lie, and then once we accept that, logic and reason kind of step in to buttress it, right? So in a strict sense, there's no value in, since faith is not dependent on like evidence and logical demonstration, doubt really has no place when we're discussing faith. There's no virtue in it. Now, we might be doubting, like that's certainly, you might be doubting something, but there's no positive aspect to that. There's no virtue. The Catholic Encyclopedia says doubt in regards to the Christian religion is equivalent to its rejection. The ground of its acceptance being necessarily in every case the authority which is proposed, not the philosophical or scientific doctrines or its intrinsic demonstrability. So this means that doubt never has a positive value in Christianity. Again, I'm not saying that you might not doubt or that you might not struggle with doubt, but it never has a positive value, right? So doubt should not be praised. You should not be like, well, like you have spiritual leaders who are saying that like doubt is a normative aspect of the Christian. Well,
you give an example, and understanding this correctly.
Let's read this.
Just read it. I mean, it was pretty.
So this person said, this is a high-ranking ecclesiastical prelate who made this comment. Christians who have not experienced a crisis of faith are missing something. On many occasions, I find myself in a crisis of faith. Sometimes I question Jesus and even doubted. Is this really the truth? Is it a dream? This happened when I was a boy, a seminarian, a religious, a priest, a bishop, and even now as pope. So that's a high-ranking prelate who says that. Now, you might be saying, but like you just talked about wrestling, and that we have to embrace wrestling, right?
Right.
What wrestling is, so wrestling is when you're like trying to accept something and you just don't understand how it fits together. Yes. It's like you're moving through a dark room and you just don't see the path clearly, and you're trying to find your way through. That's different from doubt. That's different from doubting.
Right. To say sometimes I've questioned Jesus, and like that seems perplexing to me.
Yeah,
it seems very perplexing.
Yeah,
to me.
And so he's saying here, not only is he saying that he's questioned Jesus and doubted, but that every Christian is missing something if we haven't doubted Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit beyond mere wrestling with something.
Sure.
This is like he's saying it's normative and even praiseworthy to doubt. Now, sometimes God uses doubt as a means of bringing us through. We can go through a period of doubt, and then God uses that. Mm-hmm. Just like I was Pentecostal once, and God used that. Yeah, he's not. I was like, what? Yeah, I was Pentecostal once, and God used that to bring me to Catholicism.
Okay.
Or I was once this or that, and God used that. But that doesn't mean those things have positive value. Like, that doesn't mean I would say people, yeah, go be Pentecostal. Yeah. It's a way to God. So you might experience doubt. God might use that doubt. But would I ever say doubt has a positive value and that it's normative that we should all doubt? Absolutely not. That's just awful to say.
Yes. Yeah, no, that was very revealing. So let's see. I'm gonna go to the last chapter.
Oh, good.
Chapter 40, and I thought it was a perfect way to end the book. Yeah. Thank you for putting this in the book. It was just a beautiful chapter. First of all, I wanted to mention how, like, what was this? Why did he send you this response?
Yeah. So
what precipitated it?
Yeah. This is the chapter's called "Response to Robert."
Mm-hmm.
Robert is a longtime reader of my blog, and he's a friend. And so he wrote me a letter, just expressing some difficulties he was having. And I kind of addressed them in the letter. He's got fear that his children won't keep the faith. He's not because there's any signs they're losing the faith, but he's just anxious, about it. He's worried about the state of the world. He's worried about the state of the church. He's worried because his own prayer before the Blessed Sacrament doesn't really feel anything, So he's got just various issues going on that he just wrote about. And so I just wrote him a lengthy response, kind of encapsulating everything we've talked about in the book. I think the last chapter really sums everything up.
I think so too, yes.
Yeah, which was to... Yeah, how about I just read this paragraph here?
Sure.
Did you have one you want me to read? I was going to read this one here.
No, you can read that.
Yeah. So what I told him, I said, it's easy to get bogged down by the weight of the world's problems. We can feel torn, as if the survival of Western civilization depends upon our own meager efforts. It sounds as though this has affected you to a degree. But we imagine our theater of action as vastly broader than it is. In actuality, it's quite small, confined to the tiny, fleeting moments we retain control over. A moment so brief it's gone by the time we even conceive of it. But it is to our great benefit that the window is so small, for it puts our salvation into a context we can manage. The grand arc of my life, my eternal destiny, that of my children and friends, and the will of God overarching it all, that's all too much for me to maintain in my head and heart. As the psalm says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me, far too lofty for me to reach. Thank God he does not ask me to navigate such a tremendous vessel all at once. Rather, he commits to me a single oar and tells me, row well and live. He entrusts me with a single coin and says, use this wisely. And that I can manage, especially with the aid of his grace, which enlightens my mind. The burden of our salvation is actually quite small. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. That's not to say salvation is not of tremendous import, obviously, but it is one of the paradoxes of the kingdom of God that the import of such a grave matter can be a burden of light and an easy yoke. Just because something is important does not mean it must be draining. I am reminded of Chesterton's famous quip, angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. To achieve great things, we must become small. That includes shrinking the locus of our attention in the way that Christ suggested in the Beatitudes. And then I'll read one more passage.
Sure.
This relates to our Lord's command to be his children. We usually interpret childlike faith to relate to trust, and this is certainly true, but I think it relates to our focus. Children are concerned only with what is before them. They take no care for tomorrow and scarcely remember yesterday. Their attention is entirely fixated upon whatever they are doing at the moment. Imagine if your own spiritual attention was so fixated on the moment. Invest that kind of focus in the here and now, and you will do better. Then I quote Christ, which of you by being anxious can add 1 cubit to the measure of his life?
Wow. It's all there. It's all there in Scripture. It's all there in the...
It's in the Beatitudes.
It's
really
in the
is.
Beatitudes.
Yeah. I guess one thing I would wrap up saying on this, and maybe you have other questions, but while I'm thinking about it, even if you don't get the book, I think every Catholic, especially if you're troubled by what's going on in the world and church, go back to the Beatitudes. We're so familiar with the Beatitudes, we sometimes kind of like gloss over them because we're like, yeah, I've heard this. Mm-hmm. But like, man, really go back and think about these and pray about them, and what would these mean if I, like, what would my life look like if I really lived the Beatitudes? It really is all there. And it's with great wisdom that the Catechism says that these are the heart of the new law. And so take that to heart and go pray the Beatitudes if you're struggling.
Wow. That actually, I had some final questions, but that actually answered both of them.
All right.
I could say so much more, but I think this should do it. But I think everyone should buy the book, The Way of Life. It's available at aroucapress.com under new releases. You could also find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble.
And you've got a nice hardcover version too?
I do, with a nice dust jacket. So do purchase this book. It's full of wisdom, full of practical advice, but it's I think one of the themes, I mentioned this to the author, to Phillip, before we started, that one of the themes I saw in the book is the theme of head and heart. Yes, we have, we need to know the faith, we have intellectual reasons, etc. But also there's an aspect of the heart that we need to foster. So head and heart, not just the head, not just the heart, both. We need both. Pick this book up. It's great. It's a great book.
Thank you. Thank you for publishing it.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. Thank you. It was a pleasure.